Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the 2016 AALS Annual Meeting section on scholarship, co-sponsored by the section on new law professors, and thank you very much for that co-sponsorship. My name is Paul Horwitz. I teach at the University of Alabama School of Law, and along with Professor Elizabeth Chamblee Burch of the University of Georgia Law School, I'm the co-chair of the section on scholarship. The title of the program is The State of the Art on Placing Legal Scholarship and Its Potential Consequences. I suppose other than the consequence of placing your legal scholarship. Before we get started, some program notes. A CLE attendance sheet is located in the rear of the room. If you sign, the AALS will verify your attendance at this program for CLE purposes. Please also consider completing the session survey found on the AALS mobile app. We value your feedback. A quick word to recognize someone who isn't with us. Our friend and the friend of many people in this room and in the legal academy, a ballroom would not have been large enough, Dan Markell, was to be the chair of the section on scholarship this year, in which case, no doubt, if you have seen Dan at work, we would have had a panel entitled, "But what's the normative payoff of all this?" It takes two or more people to fill his shoes, as all of us know, so Beth and I agreed to step in, and we want to say we lament his loss and miss him dearly. Well, the idea for this program was to combine some practical assessments and advice with a little bit of critical or perhaps self-critical reflection. And the description, if I can dig it up again. Of course, I have to read what I wrote some time ago. Is as follows. Writing and placing law review articles is endlessly fascinating to legal academics. Can't promise it's fascinating to anybody else. Long a competitive but mysterious enterprise, legal scholarship has seen important recent developments. An increasing number of new law professors, for instance, come from fellowships at elite law schools where they receive shared advice on writing and placement. Moreover, legal blogs now provide a public forum to compare notes about what it takes for legal scholarship to draw attention and place well, from title length to crafting abstracts. This program assesses the state of the art of legal scholarship from both a strategic and a critical perspective. It considers two principal questions. First, what are the best or at least trendiest approaches to framing, writing, and placing legal scholarship, whether at the substantive level of subject matter or method, or at the technical or strategic level of titles, abstracts, novelty claims, cover letters, and so on. Second, as these practices are routinized and shared, should we be concerned about them? Are the techniques that encourage elite journal editors to publish an article consistent with the norms of serious academic work? Or are there worrisome tensions between what it takes for an article to succeed and the values and integrity of serious legal scholarship? So again, a bit of practical advice and a bit of critical reflection. We have a wonderful set of speakers with some fascinating remarks, and that will be followed by Q&A, and we hope a lively discussion to which all of you are certainly welcome to contribute. Let me briefly name our speakers, and then we'll get started. In order, we're going to hear from Shari Motro, who teaches at the University of Richmond School of Law, Jason Mazzone, who is the Lynn H. Murray Faculty Scholar in Law at the University of Illinois College of Law, Riva Siegel, the Nicholas DeBurn, did I get the middle correct? Close enough? Yeah, good enough. The Katzenbach Professor of Law at Yale Law School, Ed Rubin, who teaches at Vanderbilt Law School, and Jonathan Masur, who teaches at the University of Chicago Law School. All of them, again, have some wonderful remarks. We think they'll be reasonably brief, and we look forward to you joining in afterwards. So if we can start with Professor Motro. Thank you.
So when people talk about publishing as a game, sometimes I find myself wondering whether this is all a mistake, being a law professor. Maybe actually I belong to some other tribe. But other times this is perfect, and I feel like the constraints actually support the work that I'm here to do. So I want to use a story from my tradition, read through mindfulness perspective, to talk about the dual themes of this panel and how I've worked with them, with the strategic and the critical perspective on placement. So I'm going to talk about the Exodus, which read metaphorically answers the question, how do humans experience constriction? Egypt in Hebrew means narrow place. And we have 5 stages. The first is passing, or fake it till you make it. The second is fighting. The third is running away or stepping back. The fourth is talking truth to power, and the fifth is taking the leap of faith. And Exodus presents these as stages in a progression, but I want to suggest that each one might be a skillful, appropriate response depending on the circumstances. And we might actually move in and out of different stages, even in the same day. Okay, so first, passing. Moses is born a Hebrew slave, but he grows up in Pharaoh's court. At some point, he probably sensed that something wasn't right, that part of him felt out of place. But those first few years, he did nothing. He went along. He wore the mask. Sometimes this is what we have to do. Before tenure, a lot of my energy went towards passing. In class, I tried to impersonate my law school professors. In writing, I tried to sound confident even when I was uncertain. And when I had an idea that I knew that the law review editors would like, I put all of my eggs in that basket instead of pulling on multiple threads, some of which weren't reducible to legally cognizable solutions. This is how I came to frame my last paper before tenure, which I called Preglamony, which the real interest, the real thing that interested me in it was the link between unmarried lovers who conceive and this idea of sex against desire. But sex against desire, some people would say, well, that's not really law, right? So I created a tax deduction. So men who pay their pregnant lovers would get a tax deduction. And I wrote this paper, and it wasn't exactly 100% passing, right? I stand behind the project still. I think it's an interesting idea. But it's incomplete. And before tenure, I kept this to myself. But if we bottle things up for too long, we snap. Moses goes along, he's groomed to be part of the machine, until one day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. The second stage is fighting, reactivity, violence. Egypt, the enemy, can be something external, a tenure committee, a mean comment on student evaluations, a mentor who snubs us, or internal, it could be the inner critic. When we're tired and angry and conflicted and alone, when we allow these pharaohs to fester for too long, we snap. We send an email we shouldn't. We respond in anger to a colleague who meant no harm. Or maybe we're so controlled that instead of killing an external Egyptian, we turn inward. We get sick. The third stage is running away or stepping back. After he kills the Egyptian, Moses buries him in the sand and flees to the desert. He becomes a shepherd, marries a Midianite, and has a son whom he calls Gershom, stranger. For a stranger I was in a strange land, he says. Sometimes we need to escape, to leave on vacation, on sabbatical, to have a baby. Or we leave psychologically. Some people leave and never come back. Law professordom isn't for everybody. Some people become shepherds of another kind, high school teachers or ministers or organizers or writers. But some people who leave realize that they're incomplete. They have some unfinished business. As it turns out, they needed to step back in order to discover a new way to orient towards the challenges of this job. So this is the fourth stage. Moses is out tending to his sheep when he hears a voice that tells him to go back to that dark nightmare of a place, stand in front of its most powerful guardian, and negotiate his way out. He has to face Pharaoh, demand to be seen, and ask, "Let my people go." He doesn't want to, but the voice, the burning bush, won't let him hide. It burns but doesn't consume, and it will keep burning until he goes back into the belly of the beast. The fourth stage is showing up in this job with all of who we are. In my case, it was writing a paper called Scholarship Against Desire, in which I named the strategic choices that I made on the road to tenure and started to craft a voice that feels more authentic and that includes left and right brain thinking, analysis, and narrative. It's honest about complexities instead of defending one solution as if I was writing a brief. Talking truth to power looks different for every scholar. For you, it might be substantive, ideological, personal, methodological. Whatever form your rebellion takes, if you do it out in the open, Pharaoh is going to resist. He has to. If he didn't resist, he wouldn't be Pharaoh. That's his role. Your role is to ask, his role is to say no. And when he says no, your role is to ask again and again and again. Pharaoh's no's bring disaster on him and on his people. The plagues are the suffering that come from resistance. When Scholarship Against Desire started to pour out of me, I thought, I can't do this. This is career suicide. That's one plague, fear. When I was writing part 2, which is a sketch of the paper that I would have written had I not been busy trying to impress about sex against desire, I was constantly second-guessing myself. It seemed naive, banal, exposing, disjointed. This is another plague, doubt. When I presented an early draft at a faculty colloquy and faced a sea of unfriendly faces, I wanted to crawl into a hole. This is another plague, shame. Eventually, if you persevere, something gives. And when that happens, go. Go quickly. Don't hang around saying long goodbyes. It's time. Pharaoh finally relents and the Israelites leave in haste. But Pharaoh changes his mind and chases after them. So on one side, there's Pharaoh and his chariots, and on the other side, the roaring sea, and they have no idea how to swim, right? So what are they supposed to do? Fight, run, stand facing him and ask again, let us go? No. Act 5 is something new. It's taking the leap into the unknown. We don't know that the waters are going to part. Maybe they won't. We might drown. But we know that there's no going back. Faith is trusting myself that the only way is forward. My leap of faith was actually publishing Scholarship Against Desire. When I started, I thought that it was my way of saying goodbye to law reviews. But the parting of the waters for me was realizing that Egypt isn't legal scholarship, but a particular interpretation of what it is and can be. And the surprise is that I'm now writing another law review article. I don't know if I'll publish it, we'll see, but I'm writing. As it turns out, I love being a law professor, especially now that I'm showing up for it in a fuller way. I love that my job is to try my best to use words to stand up to resistance, to name my vision of justice, to ask for it again and again, to wade into uncertain waters, believing that freedom is always possible. Thank you.
We'll hear next from Jason Mazzone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for including me on this panel. I think some of what I'm going to say is consistent with what Shari said. I do have some sort of strategy ideas, but I think I'll save them for a little bit later, and get to the complaints, or at least the critique. And I'd like to talk a bit about methodology. It seems to me that a lot of new professors sort of stumble along, without ever really being told how to go about producing legal scholarship. Now, most of them are smart enough that we eventually sort of figure it out. But there isn't the sort of training that occurs in other disciplines. In other disciplines, before you're allowed to start producing scholarship, you spend a great deal of time, 3-4 courses, for example, learning about method, right? Learning about how you should go about choosing a topic, framing a topic, doing a literature review, identifying the best research approach, and so on. There isn't really any systematic way in which this kind of training is imparted to law professors. Instead, there's a kind of osmosis. Right? You sort of watch, look, see what other people are doing, and replicate what they're doing. That can be hazardous because those people might have bad habits, and so you pick those up. Also hazardous because you might just be seeing kind of the end product rather than all of the initial steps that went into creating the end product, and that's the sort of thing you really need to know at the outset. You might acquire methodological training in certain settings. So increasingly we have PhD degree holders in law schools, and they've gone through a methodological training program, but that's in another discipline. It's not necessarily easily transferred to the pursuit of legal scholarship, and I think it comes with the risk that if you've gone through one of those training programs and then you enter the law school, sometimes the method itself becomes kind of who you are. So if you have sort of empirical training, for example, then you see every single problem as one that can be addressed by empirical methods. The method almost becomes the discipline or the field that you identify with, rather than just a tool for answering a particular question. Nobody really talks much about method, again in a systematic way. There are, even at this conference, there are courses, short courses on certain methodological approaches. Some law schools have courses on how to write law review articles, but I don't think that there is sort of systematic training that exists in other disciplines. And I think that this is a problem. It's a problem, first of all, because I don't know that we have a very good sense even of what method would look like in legal scholarship or in the legal academy. That's a conversation that I think would be a useful conversation to have, but it's problematic because I think it comes with some significant costs. And so one cost that I see in my field in particular, which is constitutional law, is really the problem of the law review article, the extensive law review article that is basically a brief, right? And so you've all seen these. These are articles that talk about how a particular case should be decided or how it should have been decided, and it looks very much like a brief rather than what we might think of as a scholarly undertaking. I wrote something about this recently, and one of the points of pushback I got was, well, he doesn't like normative work, but normative work is quite different from just sort of mere advocacy. There are some very good, very sophisticated people in the legal academy doing normative work, some of them in my own institution, but normative work is not simple advocacy. Here's how I think something should turn out, and I will identify the sources that support that argument. And I think this is really a reflection of the failure of methodological training. If you went through sort of a serious program of methodological training, you would identify this as problematic and as coming with some risks. Related to the problem of the brief posing as a law review article, there is often in the literature that is published, and I think particularly of entry-level candidates, there's little sense of how one would go about producing a scholarly work on a topic in which one has a personal stake or personal experience. Now, in other disciplines, those kinds of things would be red flags, right? It's not to say that you shouldn't write on these topics, but you would be taught that safeguards are needed to make sure that what you are generating is in fact free of the kind of biases that those experiences or attachments might produce. Instead, in the legal academy, it seems to be the reverse inference, that if I have had a personal experience on some issue, if I have a personal stake on some issue, then I am qualified to write about it, to draw upon that experience as a basis for generating scholarship. I think that this is problematic. It's one that again, methodological training would at least alert you to as a potential problem, so that steps are needed to make sure that you're not simply generating insights from your own experience. And then there are two particular things that I wanted to mention that I think exacerbate the problems that I've referred to. But one is the VAP ship, right? So VAPs are, we like VAPs, VAP ships, my own VAP is in the room. We like VAP ships. They're designed as an opportunity for somebody to learn how to be a law professor before they actually become a professor. I would think that that would be a good time to learn how to go about producing scholarship. But VAPs typically don't get that training. And the reason is that the VAP ship is both too short and too long. It's too long in the sense that if it only lasted, say, 2 months, then you could have sort of a 2-month intensive period which you would be taught or otherwise acquire the skills of doing research, and then you would start doing your scholarship. Right? So it's too long in that sense. It's too short in the sense that it's 2 years, but you're on the market really at the end of the first year. And so to be on the market at the end of the first year, you have to have published ideally, or be very close to publishing something at that point, which means that in order to do that, you have to start writing right away. And there is not really, again, any sort of extended or sustained period for training in methods, for learning how to go about doing what it is that we would like you to, to do. And once you've started generating your initial articles, picked up bad habits, it's hard to correct those later on. Certainly, as Shari has already mentioned, you get sort of signals, right, of what's good, what's bad. People shift uncomfortably in their seats or sort of frown at faculty workshops, but this isn't any kind of systematic feedback that would be useful. And then the second thing that I think I would like to complain a bit about is the faculty workshop. Right? So we all know how these work, sort of the 1-hour lunchtime workshop, which somebody comes and presents a paper. This would be a potentially wonderful way to engage somebody at an early stage of a project and talk about methodology, right? Talk about how it is you're going to go about pursuing this research topic. Instead, for whatever reason, it turns out that people who show up to present, they've basically finished the project. Sometimes it's even published. And so it's hard to, at that point, raise your hand and say, I have a suggestion about how you might go about investigating this issue. Because the posture of the presenter is defensive, defending what they've done, they don't want to start over. And so I don't see this as a particularly fruitful way to benefit the scholarly enterprise. I would love to see faculty workshops centered around what Shari has herself written about, and Ed has also written about notions of modesty and vulnerability. So you show up with 5 pages or 10 pages, and you say, "I have no idea where this is going, and I really need your help," and maybe it won't go anywhere. I think that this would be a much more productive and useful conversation, both for the people listening, the audience, and for the person who is presenting. The worst possible thing, of course, is if you are a VAP and you're sent off to do a workshop in your first year of your VAPship. I mean, it's sort of all over at that point because it's the combination of the two evils. All right, so those are some concerns that I have about how legal scholarship is generated. As I said, I have some thoughts about strategies of sort of, I think that's slightly off the wall ideas about how to sort of play the law review game, things that I've picked up from people who are more strategic and savvy than I am. But I'll save them for the later discussion. Thank you.
Will this work if I sit here? Can people hear me? Yes? No? Yes. That's a yes. Okay. My instinct is to do this sitting down because my remarks are informal and it sort of just feels appropriate to context. Sad to say, it's been a while since I started teaching, and I don't feel proximate to the placement process in a way that feels so constructive. I tried raising this objection to participating on the panel, and it was suggested that, I work with students or alums who go into teaching, and I might talk a bit out of that context. And so, looking out into the audience, even at one or two, I'll say yes. So I'll just say a few words about thinking about the writing process from the context of going into the business of producing scholarship. But it's very hard to speak in the abstract as opposed to particular projects. And so what follows are just a few comments that are about both the outward-facing and then the inward-facing parts of writing, not nearly so eloquently framed as Shari's remarks. So when we think about what we're trying to do as scholars, we are working to alter the way we understand the world, one another understands the world, and maybe the ways in which we live in the world as a consequence of those shifts in understanding the world. And that way of thinking about it really sort of pushes to the foreground the extent to which writing is a relationship. It's about forging some kind of connection between you and some other set of readers, other community. And thinking about it that way helps, I think, in ways sort of big and small. We were asked something about newness or novelty in writing in the panel call, and so much of what I think about what gets valued as original work really is not something that's genuinely disjunctive or out there standing by itself, but is best understood as an intervention in a conversation that changes a conversation in some way. It's relational in that sense. If it were genuinely other, it might really be original, but it's not clear to me that it would be valued that way as scholarship, whereas the stuff that seems to be valued is at least knows about the community whose reasoning it wants to disrupt or alter or transform in some way. And that way of thinking about the problem really poses, I think, a set of issues for somebody who's going into writing in a given area. On the one hand, setting up a relationship of that kind requires a kind of engagement, immersion, sometimes it's called literacy. But with all of that comes the threat of getting normalized to a field, getting tyrannized by the quest for literacy, the sort of worry always that there's something else to read or somebody else to answer to. And so it seems to me to set up a problem of being sufficiently engaged to understand the world with whom one's speaking, but yet having practices that disrupt that relationship so that its imaginative and professional authority over you is not too perfectly controlling, and then you just become normalized, you become conventional in your way of understanding things. So, and everyone has their own ways of disrupting that relationship, whether it's being in several fields or going into practice or taking an interdisciplinary turn, or whatever, something to disrupt the shape of the conversation as it exists where one finds it, and to protect oneself from being too thoroughly tyrannized by the presence of this stream of scholarship with which one needs to engage, but which one hopes somehow or other to transform. I think that this model of relationship is also helpful for thinking about what's happening when one's writing, in the sense that when one writes, one has a relationship to an audience, and usually multiple audiences in a piece. Most of the pieces that I write, I imagine myself in conversation with more than one kind of reader, whether it's because readers are plural by reason of discipline, or they're plural by reason of subject matter field, or they're plural because of differences in normative outlook. You know, people who agree with me, people who don't agree with me, people who are ambivalent, sort of how is anything I'm writing engaging with those disparate audiences, and doing all of that concurrently. There's another sense in which audience I think is also important, and that's to be aware of the fact that when one's writing, I was thinking about this in terms of the placement question that the panel call focused on. On the one hand, one's trying to engage people who are already writing in an area, and let's just call them the insiders. But a young person writing has to be acutely aware of how outsiders to the conversation are going to read what they're writing, because whether one thinks about it as the students on the law review who are deciding what to publish, or one thinks about it as the community of the faculty who's reviewing one's work, there are going to be all these readers who are precisely not steeped in the areas in which one's writing, and so one needs to make them literate sufficiently to appreciate the stakes, and one needs to make them aware of how it is that you're doing something connected and yet distinct. And that's another set of relationships in view. So I mentioned stakes, and the last turn on this I want to take is to say that when you're writing, it really matters why you're writing. Like, you need to be staying close always to your goals in writing. Why does it matter in terms of scholarship, in terms of legal practice, in terms of people living in the world? And I think my last point, when I was puzzling about what on earth I might have to say to this on this panel, was to think also about the stakes for you. And this is my sort of turn from the sort of paying attention to people in the world as one's writing, and to really sort of pivot around and say how much I think it's important in this business of understanding that you're engaged in something that really moves you to get out of bed in the morning and wrestle with it. And the irony of thinking practically about sort of placing things in or writing work in one's early stages of scholarship is that the first big paper that I published, really the first paper that I published when I started teaching, was a piece that was framed out precisely in violation of the advice that I had been given. And I'm grinning at Ed because we were in the same community when this was happening. And I, in thinking about this, basically did everything I was told not to do. And I'm here to tell the story, so something worked out. But that seemed germane in a situation like this because I was being advised in a variety of ways. I don't want to get into the details, but not to write in a certain field. And I was being advised, the field was con law generally. I also was being advised, and I think sensibly, to write quickly and to write some short pieces, and I did none of those things. I wrote a very long piece in constitutional law, and it was terrifying to do because I picked out something that was much too big for me to start with, and which was violating a whole set of conventions in the ways that I framed it out. Without going into the details, though, I can say that I cared fiercely about what I was writing about. And that was the saving difference for me in doing that work. The details don't matter, but basically this was so long ago that I was just starting when Roe was about to be overturned in Casey, and it was engaging with the abortion question and trying to say that there would still be an equal protection argument still left on the table, even if the court reversed the Roe decision. So it was writing to attack Roe and the entire framing of the abortion issue. That was not a way to start. And I put everything on the table in working on this, and I wrote a piece that was way too large, and every piece of it that I wrote, I was told that I hadn't answered X number of questions, and so wrote another section to write some more to answer those questions. That is not the right way to write a first paper, I can assure you. But I also can tell you that every day that I woke up, I knew, even if I wouldn't have a job at the end of the day, that I was writing about something I cared about. And did survive to tell the story. And the paper is still sitting around. But an interesting feature of this, per the call of this panel, is that when I sent it out, one law review took it, and every single other law review turned it down. That is to say, it was out long enough for me to know that Stanford took the paper, and literally every other law review rejected it. And it wound up in cases in various ways and still is kicking around. And that's only to say that there were risks, and I made decisions that weren't advisable and that were risky, and things could have turned out otherwise. But I think this goes to Shari's point that I chose something that was putting everything on the line, and that was a different way of being in my work. And it made me write differently, and it made me inhabit the business of writing differently. And I think that my instinct is just to raise this only to say that I do believe, I mean, the paper had to be answerable to various audiences. I do believe that becoming deeply literate in what that's about is a crucial part of the process, but not in a way that it makes you lose touch wholly with what matters to you and what drove you into doing this work in the first place. And so I thought if I were going to speak to being practical, I ought to say something against practical reason at the same time, and to sort of invite people to live in the tension between those two things, as I say, far less eloquently than you have. But I think it's a crucial business about doing this right.
Here next for Professor Ed Rubin.
Hi, well, my remarks are equally informal, but I'm going to stand to conceal that fact. I'm pleased to have been invited, and I think the topic, the issue that this panel raises is really an interesting one, and that is this relationship between scholarship as an abstract pursuit, let's say the inquiry into truth or maybe validity, and scholarship as a strategic matter of managing your own career. We can imagine a real dichotomy between these things. On the one hand, one wants to, as both Shari and Revo talked about, write about something that's meaningful to you and that has validity. On the other hand, there are the grimy details of trying to place it. So there's a question, should I call my friend who's at X law school and ask him to intervene before the law review sends me their typical letter that, yes, we thank you for submitting your piece, but we get 10,000 pieces a year, and yours didn't come anywhere close to our minimal standard. That's implicit, but that's what they're saying, right? So, you can think of that as a real dichotomy. But what I was thinking about in response to this question is actually there's a continuum running from the most abstract or the most selfless considerations to the most strategic ones. And it really seems that there are a number of places, there are a number of continuities, and as I thought about it, really a little hard to actually draw the line and say when you've crossed from one category into another. So to begin with, everybody has to make a choice about the basic field that they're going to go into. I mean, I think the only person I can think of who could write about everything was Aristotle, and even he got a lot of it wrong, right? So, that's a strategic choice in some sense. And of course, in this world of interdisciplinary scholarship, which is increasingly common, it's not only a matter of choosing a field of law. Back in the days when everybody shared basically the same type of training, and it was just a matter of which field appealed to you, but what other bodies of knowledge can you bring to it, either from practice or from another degree or from some area of life experience, so that you'll have a comparative advantage. And if you think about it, of course, there's an element of strategy to that, even though it's a necessary choice in the mere pursuit of truth, namely to pick a particular area that you're going to focus on. And then within your area, the next question has to be, what's the choice of topic? Now again, there's a abstract quality to this. What do I have to say that I believe is valid or I believe is right? But there's also a question of having something to say that's original and striking enough to get attention. So if you just imagine very traditional scholarship writing about Supreme Court opinions, you could take two approaches. One is to say that the Supreme Court got this decision right and its reasoning was excellent. The other is to say either the Supreme Court got it wrong and its reasoning was terrible, the Supreme Court got the result right, but its reasoning was terrible. Now, both of those can be heartfelt expressions of your own views. But the first one isn't going to get published. It's not going to get published because it doesn't offer an insight. If you're Janet Yellen or maybe Donald Trump, it would get published because it's significant that you as a power holder or you as an influential person agrees with this position. But as a scholar, as someone who's not wielding power and supposed to contribute insight, you've got to choose things that you have something to say about that's different. And then this raises the question of how striking or how outrageous you want to be. And there's always a balance there between emphasizing or exaggerating one's position in order to make it seem more insightful or more original, and on the other hand, having a voice that seems reasonable and defensible. So that's another strategic decision that goes to the real content of what you're presenting. Then another question, moving, I think, down the spectrum, but still it seems to me clear, intrinsic to scholarship, is what fights are you going to pick? Who are you going to argue with? So just an example from my own work, I wrote a book where I called into question the certain basic terms as being holdovers from medieval thought and not appropriate to the modern administrative government. And one of the ones I chose was legitimacy. And it's an easy case to make that the term legitimacy comes from hereditary monarchy, where the whole issue was whether or not the reigning monarch had a legitimate heir, and if not, there's likely to be a civil war, so it's really important. In my subsequent work, I just use the term legitimacy the way everybody else does. I'm not going to pick that fight again, because there's no need to if I'm writing about something else. So there are many cases where, for example, there's a very contentious political issue, and it's best to avoid it unless one needs to confront it, not because it's not necessarily because it's irrelevant or because it's not what you feel, but simply because there's no need to either alienate or raise questions in among your audience if that's not what you're trying to get at. Moving further along the line, we have questions of framing. How do you frame it to get people's attention? And of course, you're trying to get attention very often from law review editors who really aren't very familiar with your field. So there's a question of how au courant or how, again, striking you want to be. Then there's the question, and this gets, I think, even further towards strategy, but you can see it's still it still goes to content of how do you structure your argument. So one way that arguments get well known is if you can come up with the name of something. I mean, think about Alexander Bickel, one of the titanic figures, right, of legal scholarship. And unless you're in that exact field, unless you do con law, you're likely to know one thing about his thought, which is the phrase counter-majoritarian difficulty. I mean, that's a brilliant characterization, but it's a name. So Shari gave us a biblical theme, so to continue that, God creates the animals, but he doesn't name them. He says to Adam, you name them, and whatever name Adam gives the animals is the name. Well, why is that? Well, there are at least two explanations. One is that naming things is intrinsic to our conceptual process. If Adam is to be human, if he's to be a human being, then he needs to be the one to name things, that naming process makes him human. But there's, I think, a sort of deeper meaning to it, which is that God couldn't name the animals. He couldn't choose the names. Now that sounds unorthodox because God is supposed to be omnipotent, right? But here's the point. This passage comes immediately after the passage about God telling Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge. So you think, well, how does he name the animals if he doesn't have knowledge? But the tree of knowledge is specific. It's knowledge of good and evil. So right after that, Adam names the animals. Well, because it's not a question of judgment. I mean, judgment could be involved. This is a contestable point. But it's a question of simple conceptual control of something, even independent of the judgments you reach. That is to say, to name things, to come up with a characterization, can be the basis for normative argument, and a strategy by which your argument becomes memorable and significant. This can be either taking things that were previously given the same name and distinguishing between them and creating two separate names, or creating things that were originally separate and noticing the similarity between them and giving them a common name. But the point being that God couldn't have... the problem with God giving the names is that Adam could always change them. He can't create an animal. Maybe these days we'll be able to soon. But he can't create an animal, but he can always create a new name because that's part of the conceptual process. And God could certainly force Adam to use a particular name, but not consistent with giving him free will. That's built into the very structure of what it means to have free will, is to be able to name things. And so the point being that there's a kind of an arbitrariness, a kind of personal control over this naming process. And on the one hand, it's very often the most significant scholarly contribution. On the other hand, it's really a strategic consideration of how am I going to create a name, how am I going to create a category that will be memorable and will sort of trademark my ideas. And just to circle back to the final point about interdisciplinary scholarship, that's often where other disciplines come in providing us with names that the discipline itself, the doctrine, doesn't generate, to provide us with additional terminology that can be used to establish that kind of naming function. So that's just the sort of notion of a continuum between the most theoretical or the most disinterested and things that begin to sound a great deal like strategy, but I think there's a real unity among them because of the conceptual nature of the field.
Final speaker before Q&A will be Jonathan May.
I'd like to thank Paul and Beth for really putting together this really wonderful panel and for the invitation to participate. I think that my fellow panelists have beautifully framed all of these sorts of questions. So I guess I want to speak briefly about building on some things that have been said already on what I see as the distortions in the work we do and the scholarship we write that are being introduced by the need to publish in law reviews. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about VAP and fellowship programs and maybe even about faculty workshops, sort of inspired by Jason and others' comments. So first of all, I don't think that this is going to be a surprise to anyone. The professional advantages that flow from publishing in top law reviews, the desire to publish in top law reviews, lead to a whole series of, I think, pretty well understood pathologies in the type of scholarship we write. An emphasis on overclaiming as to the novelty of an idea, overclaiming as to the decisiveness of the conclusion you have reached. You have proven something, as opposed to you have raised questions and there remains doubt. An overemphasis on being clever and coming up with an idea that sort of looks clever and counterintuitive, often at the expense of making sort of slow and steady progress that's less sexy. And I would say, building on what Ed just said also, an emphasis on naming things and trying to give catchy names to what are old ideas that have pre-existed, as opposed to making conceptual progress of one's own. And I think Ed is right that the name itself can, in some ways, further the conceptual understanding. But I do believe that there is an enormous amount of effort put into sort of trying to brand and trademark ideas that are not actually new ideas in ways that sort of waste time and talent of the people doing it. And so, this has lots of deleterious consequences for the work that we do. It causes people to obscure complexity. Instead of an issue where there are lots of outstanding questions and nothing's been proven, but we know now we have a framework for weighing two sides of an issue, people want to decisively say that they've proven something. There's a tendency to ignore earlier work if you want to emphasize how novel and interesting your issue is. Everyone's writing on a blank slate. Everyone is talking about something that no one's ever thought of before. And so it leads us to ignore the important work that has been done by the people who came before us. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. Law review editors give us incentives to pretend that we're not. And also, as I said, forsaking opportunities to make slow and steady progress in a field at the expense of trying to do something flashy. And these are all introduced by the fact that we are submitting our articles to 2Ls and 3Ls who are running law reviews and don't know the fields especially well and are sort of easily seduced by claims of novelty and pictures of cleverness. So this is the moment, I think, when most people say that the whole problem is that we don't use peer review in legal scholarship and that we ought to switch to more peer review. And I'm not going to say that because I don't think we're going to do that. I just don't think that that is a politically feasible option. There's a little bit more peer review now than there was when I started teaching, but not that much. And the vast majority of us are still going to publish the vast majority of our articles in student-run law reviews. So what do I think we should be doing instead? There are moments of peer review that occur in the life of a law school academically, and I think we should be taking advantage of those moments, which is to say when tenure committees evaluate someone's work, when appointments committees decide who to make offers to or visiting offers, either at the entry level or at the lateral level, when people who run workshops decide whom to invite to those workshops, or even when a faculty goes through an internal evaluation process to decide whether someone deserves a raise or a promotion or something like that. Those are moments when we should be reading the work carefully. Those are the moments when we should be acting as careful peer reviewers, not as resume glancers who just look at the placements of the articles. I've had too many conversations with people who say, well, of course so-and-so is going to get tenure. Look, she's published 5 articles in top 10 journals. And that, to me, is a complete non sequitur, and I think we should all treat it as a non sequitur. And so I think those are opportunities that we as academics should be engaging in, even though they are more time consuming. It is more time consuming to actually read the work carefully than it is to glance at the resume and make judgments based on the placements. But we should think of the work that we're doing at those moments as spending the time that we've saved by not being peer reviewers at the journal placement moment, and cashing in those chips that we've accrued by allowing the 2Ls and the 3Ls to be the ones who make the screening decisions for us. So that is the direction I think that the field should go, and that I think would be something that cured a lot of the pathologies inherent to law review publishing. Okay, so now on the topic of VAP and fellowship programs and possibly faculty workshops as well, which is part of the original sort of design of the panel and part of the reason I was intrigued by it. I'm a product of a fellowship program and I helped run a fellowship program for quite a long time. I basically agree wholeheartedly with Jason's diagnosis of the problem of a lack of methodological training in legal scholarship, and I take his grievance to be not just that there are people trying to do quantitative empirical work who aren't good at doing quantitative empirical work, but more broadly that people don't quite understand the methodology of writing even a standard qualitative analytic law review article, how to ask a good question, how to frame the inquiry properly, the right analytic tools to go about looking at the problem with, et cetera. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but okay, good. So I think that's how I understood it also, and I agree with that diagnosis. But the theme, I guess, of what I want to say is, there are good ways and there are bad ways to do everything. So agreeing with that diagnosis, I'm then forced, I think, to completely disagree with Jason's sort of ascription of the problem, although I think that what he said is incredibly insightful and valuable. So what we do in law in fellowship and VAP programs is not that dissimilar from what every other discipline is doing in PhD programs. The coursework that you do in your first 2 years of PhD program is pretty similar in many ways to the coursework that you're doing in your 3 years of law school. And then after those 2 years of coursework, those PhD students go off and they try to produce scholarship informed by graduate students above them, maybe postdocs who are working underneath their advisor, and informed by their advisor, himself or herself. And there can be good mentorship where people really guide you through the process, and there can be bad mentorship. But that's how they learn to do scholarship. In the law, that's sort of what our VAP and fellowship programs look like as well. People come to us after X number of years of coursework, and then they receive sometimes good and sometimes bad mentorship about how to go about producing scholarship. Now, there are VAPs and fellowships, I'm sure, where the person is stuck in an office for a year and they have to learn how to write on their own, and that is not a good way to conduct a VAP or a fellowship. But the best versions of these are the ones in which people are receiving valuable guidance about how the methodology of how to be a legal academic at every step along the way. The first thing they're doing is walking into their advisor's office, or maybe a couple different advisors' offices, and saying, I've got 10 kernels of ideas. Which of these do you think is going to make for the best paper? How am I going to develop it? Help me with these steps. Or then, now I've developed my kernel of an idea here, I wrote 4 pages. Why don't you read my 4 pages and tell me what you think? And engaging in an iterative process with the people who are meant to be advising them. And in that sense, it should be much more than osmosis. It should be actual mentorship and actual learning. And that, to me, is maybe not the best or the most ideal, but a very good way to teach people the methodology of how to be legal scholars. And certainly superior to what we used to have. Now, I do agree with Jason that in many cases these fellowships are too short. A year is a very short span of time to learn these techniques. It would be better if the fellowship were 3 years or 4 years. But I think that we don't live in a world in which we used to have 3 and 4 year fellowships or VAP programs that would train people, and now we've scaled it back. We live in a world in which people used to go on the job market straight out of a clerkship or straight out of practice, and they wouldn't have any of this mentorship experience. So we have increased the amount of training that people are receiving, not decreased the amount of training. So I would love it if people were willing to sign up for longer 3 and 4 year fellowships. But I do think that what we have, the 1 or 2 year fellowship, is superior to what came before it, which was to say none of the above. And I guess I'll say very quickly also about faculty workshops. Again, I think there are good and there are bad ways to do these sorts of things. And I completely agree with Jason that the faculty workshop in which the person shows up with the published 80-page paper is not particularly valuable as a way to give someone guidance on how to improve that paper. It might be valuable in lots of other ways. Among other things, that person is educating her colleagues about her scholarship, which I think is a very valuable enterprise. But that's just to say that workshops should involve genuine works in progress, not published papers. And that's harder for younger entry-level people who feel like they're being evaluated at the workshop. But at minimum, senior people who are tenured should be presenting genuine works in progress when they give faculty workshops. And in instances where the younger people feel as though they can't come to a workshop with a true work in progress, there should be some other mechanism. There should be a junior scholars brown bag at that school, or there should be a close-knit group of confidants to whom one can circulate a draft without fear of being judged negatively. There should be something else that takes the place of it. So that people still have that experience. So, there is a good way and a bad way to do all these things, and I think that we, as an academic community, we owe it to ourselves to do things the right way, which is often the more difficult and more time-consuming way, but in the end will be the more productive, the more fulfilling way for our profession and for the work that we're trying to produce.
I want to thank all of our speakers. Before opening up the floor to questions, and I hope that many of you will participate in that, I wanted to do 2 things. And the first is to remind us that there'll be a section business meeting at the conclusion, and hope that as many of you as can will stay for that, and especially we're always looking for people to get involved in the section. And second, I'm going to use my, moderator's prerogative to do a minute of kind of post-speaker framing that maybe will help or open up the conversation, and really drawn from what people have said. So by way of a kind of a, tripartite framework, let me start this way. There's a question of insight, as Professor Rubin has said. We all care about the work we do, both for vocational reasons and out of personal passion, and also for professional career building reasons. So we're all of us interested in how to make an insight legible, visible, and noticed, as Professor Siegel said, by both insiders and outsiders. And of course, we all want to know, I have the idea or the insight, and I want to frame it. How can I do that successfully, whether it's novelty or being counterintuitive or labeling, or to take an older but still pertinent example, storytelling as a way to present an insight in a way that matters. second, worry about that. We have to do this, want to do it, but are there ways in which the norms that we pick up through engaging in this kind of strategic work potentially under-recognize true insights or overvalue false insights, at least in the places where the work is read, evaluated, and then sometimes forwarded on to prominence. Before those strategies become reified by us internally and are assimilated really as normative goods by the generation that uses them as they build a career and a professional identity, are there aspects of any of these ways of framing, ways of presenting our insights that we should second guess or worry about a little more or try structurally to address? For instance, when I write tenure letters, I don't know whether this is appreciated or hated, but I usually try to take a moment to talk about what I think that scholar ought to do next. Tenure rates are very high, right? And most of the time you're writing saying, yes, I think this person meets the school standards. But the question is, what kind of a career are they going to have next? And how might they self-critically think about that? And I think that's one opportunity. Are there other structural opportunities? And third, system. Are there ways in which the means of production, so to speak, are influencing or reifying some of these strategies, tips, standards, and so on, whether it's fellowships or a number of other possibilities? And the second thing I'd say is I think we are all both insiders and outsiders about this. We're both the people who I assume contacted Shari in great numbers after she published her article to say, I'm one of those constrained voices. I experienced this dilemma and thank you for voicing it. But we're also probably the unfriendly faces in the workshop audience who say, well, I've internalized these norms and I know you're doing it wrong. We're both people. I'm sure we want practical tips to succeed and we want a chance to worry about them. So I hope that our conversation will bring that out. Let me ask you, if you can, when you ask questions, to identify yourself and your institution. And I apologize, I will repeat questions or try to repeat them for the sake of the mic, while no doubt renaming them. So I see there is actually a microphone at the front if anybody wants to start things off. Or yeah, are there comments from the panelists, by all means? Yeah.
So just one, I just wanted to pick up on one quick thing that Ed said, and then also something that Jonathan had said also. At the beginning of Ed's comments, he referred to a strategy that at least I was not aware of when I was junior and sort of sending things out to law reviews. My sense was you send it out and then it's evaluated and so on. Ed had referred to the dial-a-friend approach, and I think this is actually increasingly common, or at least pretty common. So you call up some friend at a prestigious school and lean on them to recommend your piece to the law review, and I think I think it's successful in some fair number of cases. I don't know, how many articles get published this way. Maybe it's 50% in the top 30 or 40 journals, but it is a fair slice. And so if you're not sort of part of that network early on, then there is a kind of cost or impediment associated with what you think of as a submission process. And then picking up a little bit on something that Jonathan had said, I would like to give a plug for two ways to kind of just avoid all of the anxieties of the law review process entirely. Because like Jonathan, I read the stuff and my colleagues read the stuff, and sure there's a signal that's sent by where it's placed, but if we're looking at somebody for tenure or looking for somebody as a lateral hire, it's not a very strong signal. We actually do read the scholarship carefully, and I would hope that other people do that. And so the first plug is don't forget about your home institution. I've published a couple of things lately with the law review of my own institution. It's turned out to be a delightful experience because you don't have to send it out. You're working with your own students, and that's actually nice. There's a kind of educational, pedagogical benefit to that. Traditionally, this has been kind of looked looked down upon, like, oh, well, they couldn't place it anywhere else, so they had to give it to their own institution. I would love to see scholars say, I only publish in the journal of my own institution because I like working with my students, and that's it. Hopefully at the end, it's actually being evaluated on merits. And then the other sort of way of escaping all of this, and it was advice that I got right after I got tenure. I asked a senior person in constitutional law, what advice do you have for somebody who's gotten tenure for thinking about a scholarly career in the future? And he said, stop publishing in law reviews, just write books. And he does. And they're actually they're books that are a little bit longer than law review articles, so it's not that much more work. But he said, I just gave up on the whole law review game, and I write books, and he's been extremely successful doing that. So this is just by way of saying that there are alternatives if we are sort of captured by law reviews, and we don't like being in that cage. There are other sorts of opportunities.
Too tall for me. I'm Larry Rosenthal from Chapman. I guess this question is addressed more to Professors Mazzone and Masur, who expressed concerns about greater methodological rigor, and I suppose I share those concerns. And so it's kind of a series of related questions, although everybody else is certainly welcome to comment on it. An economist might say that if you don't accompany the search for greater analytical rigor with meaningful carrots and sticks, you're probably not going to wind up with much more in the way of analytical rigor. So my question is really realistic that we're going to make much progress on this if we don't have more meaningful annual reviews, post-tenure reviews that demand analytical rigor? Is that realistic in light of the reactions of people like Professor Motro, who are probably going to say, if you do that, you're creating hierarchy and tyranny, and we just can't have that.
Sure. So I guess I would say, I'll say something to make sure I understand your question correctly. I guess I would say that if people reach a point in their careers when they are no longer attempting to accomplish anything, where maybe they've achieved tenure already and they are not trying to receive a promotion. They do not care whether anyone reads their work. They do not care whether the work is actually good for its own merits or has an impact on anyone or makes progress in the academic field. Then there's probably nothing we can do to reach them. That sounds to me like a tenure problem as opposed to anything else. And that is, of course, a problem that pervades every field of academia, I would say just as much, if not more, than law. I guess my point is that I do think that there are all sorts of moments, even in a world in which it's 2Ls and 3Ls reading law review articles, and even in a world in which maybe there's just one tenure decision, all sorts of moments when we are evaluating one another, when we make tenure decisions, when we make appointments decisions, when we offer workshop or conference invitations and things like that. And I think that many people care about those things instrumentally, and they also just care about the value of their work and whether it reaches an audience and whether it makes a difference and whether their voice is heard and whether they've made progress and whether they've expressed themselves in a cogent way for intrinsic reasons as well. And so I think that all of those motivations provide very good opportunities to encourage the best sort of work and discourage the worst sort of work. I just want to make sure that when we then step in to evaluate people at those moments, we're evaluating them on the things that really ought to matter and not on things that don't.
I really have nothing to add except maybe to bring in the comments that Riva ended with, being excited about getting up in the morning and getting to work. I would hope that the excitement is stronger if you know that you have the tools to do a really good job rather than kind of a sloppy job or no job at all. So I guess desire for self-improvement as a scholar, I think it motivates, or it should motivate all of us.
I'm Miguel de Figueiredo from the University of Connecticut. So I've faced often with the trade-off of peer-reviewed, for instance, in my field, law and economics journals, Journal of Legal Studies, or Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization at Yale, and the law review, the student-run law reviews. And the choice is endogenous, right? Where yes, you have a question, and it might be that one forum is more appropriate than the other, but there are definitely decisions at the margin that could lead you to go one way or the other. The peer review process has its vices, right? It takes a long time. It also has its idiosyncrasies, and then the student-run law review process also has some virtues, which I don't think I heard, but you could talk about. You could use the word "should" in a sentence. That's not in the conclusion. You could be normative. You could, and so forth. And so my question, though, is. And it's perhaps hard at this level of abstraction, but are there kind of lessons for managing that trade-off between a peer-reviewed journal and a student-run law review for someone who's junior and for someone that we can, are there lessons at a level of abstraction that we can take away from managing that trade-off, and also the perceptions in the field of peer-reviewed versus, say, student-run law reviews?
Does anybody want to take a first crack?
I'll take this question too. I feel bad about. I think. I almost think the answer to your question is no, there are not lessons at a level of abstraction. I do think that publishing in both places is a good idea. I think having a portfolio theory and doing a little bit of everything is a good move. And I think that legal peer-reviewed publications are by and large very good places to publish. Even if the screening process is not perfect, it's usually pretty good, better than student-run law reviews. And even if it takes a while, I think in the legal world it doesn't take forever the way it can in other fields sometimes. And one gets really excellent feedback from one's peers when one does it. And I think those are very good places to publish. And I think that they are viewed correctly as very good places to publish. JLS, JLEO, Journal of Law and Economics, Journal of Legal Analysis, these are all highly regarded places to publish. And it's a good outlet for work that you think that the typical 2L or 3L might not understand, including very quantitatively, technically complex work. And it's a good way to demonstrate that if you have a technically complex piece, it has passed the screen of your colleagues in the academy, not just a screen imposed by 2Ls and 3Ls who might not actually be equipped to evaluate the work properly. But then again, there are audiences that one reaches when publishing in student-run law reviews that one can't always reach in peer-reviewed journals. So I would never say to someone only go for peer review. I think that choosing one or the other can be valuable across the board, and I think it's useful to put some pieces in each type of journal. And I'm sure you have a sense of when you start writing something whether it's going to make a better Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization piece, or whether it's going to make a better Harvard Law Review piece.
There is an issue of how you write the piece, as was referred to. With the law review piece, I think justifiably, not only because you're writing for students, but because you're writing for a more general audience, there's a kind of a framing or a generality. I mean, it can be satirized. So Washington Irving begins his history of New York City with the phrase, "The world is an oblate sphere turning in space." And there's some quality of that is in law review articles also, where you start off with the most general statement. And you don't have to do that when you're writing in a peer-reviewed journal, and specifically in a more of a specialty journal. And then there's a kind of a difference in style, in the kind of footnoting you do. So there is a choice to be made at the outset about which kind of journal you want to submit to.
Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Sahani. I'm at Washington and Lee University School of Law. I have a question about the pace of your scholarly pursuits. So I've heard different advice. I'm a junior person, and I've had different advice about the pace at which one should pursue scholarly endeavors. To some extent, we're sort of a slave to the taskmaster of the journal cycle, and yet on the other hand, ideas don't necessarily flow and develop at that exact pace. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you manage the scholarly trajectory with respect to when and how often and how much you may produce in a particular given year, and whether the cycles affect that at all, or whether you do it independently of the cycles. Thank you.
Okay, I can just tell you sort of my own experience. So I guess two things. One is that I've often submitted completely off cycle just because I finished something and I want to get it out the door. And I've had a fair amount of success doing that. And I hate to kind of share that tip because now other people will do it. But it's often the case that there are journals that are looking for that one last article, or somebody has not come through with the article and they just need something. And of course you just need one good placement and you're set. So I personally have not been tied very closely, for better, and I think for better rather than for worse in my case, to the March submission or the end of summer submission cycle. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say, I think for junior people in particular, one thing that is a double-edged sword is the symposium piece. Symposium pieces, they often run on somewhat different cycles. So you're invited or you invite yourself somehow and you end up you attend the symposium, publish the symposium piece. It doesn't typically track the normal submission cycle. And it's a double-edged sword because you can get a nice placement out of it and it can count favorably towards tenure. But as a junior person, and I found this myself, boy, those things take up a lot of time. And so if I were going to sort of give advice about pacing, it would be watch out for the symposium piece that is going to use up your entire summer, because even though it's a kind of shorter piece, it can take as long as writing a full-length article. So that's a sort of lesson that I learned, I think, the hard way.
So on timing, I've done both. I don't have clear advice. My most successful submission I sent out in June, so for what that's worth, and one in mid-September. So I don't know. But I'd like to turn your question into a question for my fellow panelists about when you decide to publish, because before tenure, I sent things out when people told me they were ready. And I knew, I had to be sending things out. So when somebody said it was okay, well, it's good enough, fine. And but over the years, I've written a lot more than I've published. And so for me, the pre-tenure clock was really useful discipline to get stuff out, and part of writing is being out there. But after tenure, I find myself sending things to colleagues. So that's a kind of, in my mind, it's a different form of publication. I'm not sure that this is going to do good things in the world yet. And so the do no harm discipline is much higher for me post-tenure, and I'm not trying to climb more ladders. But I'd be curious about, after tenure, if what is there's the why write, but the separate question of why and when do you publish?
I mean, I have something maybe unorthodox to say about that, so I guess I'll weigh in very quickly. I treat law review submission, the process of sending it to my colleagues or workshopping it, and then law review publication as just completely separate and almost unconnected events. And there will be many cases when I have a piece that I think is ready to send out to law reviews, but not ready to send to my colleagues because it has a problem that I haven't fixed yet. And maybe some law review will buy it, but I'm not ready to show it to a real expert in the field who will tell me what the problem is and think that I'm a fool for sending it to them. There are also times when I feel like, I think this is much more frequent, when I feel like I have a paper that I'm very ready to send to my colleagues and to workshop, but not at all ready to send out to law reviews because I've expressed the ideas, I think I've explained my argument the way I want to explain it, but the footnotes don't look pretty or don't exist, or the article's not catchy yet and I don't have a fun title or whatever. And so, I just don't worry about those things ever coinciding. And similarly with the publication date, the time between when you send something to a law review and when you actually publish it is so long, even in our student-run law review process, that it's easy to send something out to law reviews that you're not quite ready to publish yet and then spend that next year hammering it into place until it's ready to publish. So I guess my feeling about this is, write the scholarship at the pace that you want to write it. Send it to law reviews when it's ready to be sent to law reviews. Send it to your colleagues in workshop when it's ready to be sent to your colleagues and workshop it. And don't worry if those things don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other, because these are different events.
I do think that there's something about it's probably just moving along the process. So more pieces get solicited and you're less writing just to send things out cold. But part of the issue turns into knowing when you're good with something, when to hold something back, or when you're ready to move forward with it. And sometimes for purposes of some invited lecture or otherwise, I'll have something that I frame out, and I may live with it through a couple cycles of working with it before it really catches a form where I feel it's in a form that I want to go with it for getting it published. And other pieces just come together in a pretty seamless sort of way. And I wouldn't always know at the outset which is which. And it does come from framing out a problem in a way in which you're writing about something you want to be writing about, but maybe you haven't quite nailed it in the terms that you want to. Having an ear for that, less feeling like here's a process and I have to show I'm productive, and more which of these pieces do I germinate at what speed. Through that, there's a shift in what the writing process. Once you get onto a production timetable, you're on it, or if you're co-authoring, you're on it. So deadlines will appear and you'll get pushed forward. But there's more of this pieces in different stages of inception and knowing when you're really building out a project and when you're still mulling about it. And I find myself in now more often.
The topic might also determine a bit the schedule for getting it out. So I recently wrote something that was a 20th anniversary retrospective on the United States versus Lopez. So that had to be published in 2015. And so that kind of dictated when it would go out, even though if I'd taken a little bit longer, maybe it would have been better. But you might be in that situation as well.
And I assume there were lots of people starting around 1998 thinking about their 200th anniversary of Marbury piece, right? And kind of working toward that deadline.
Hi, Hayes Holderness. I'm of Vapid, Illinois, actually. I'm curious, sort of your impressions of how the sort of internet explosion and the ease with which you can transmit information and your documents has sort of maybe devalue the higher placements, and kind of turn this into a more of a practical question. What you can do after you publish to really, a really good way is to get your scholarship in front of the right people, whoever that might be.
Anybody want to take who blogs on this panel? I should ask. Jason, take a start.
Well, I rely heavily on Paul Horwitz's Facebook page for recommendations of strong scholarly pieces. So that's one way. Larry Solom is a kind of, sort of the rubber stamp of what I read. I mean, when he says highly recommended, I read that. And so getting his attention is good. And he's quite generous, so send him your stuff and say, what do you think? So then blogging, I don't know whether blogging is, if there's a future to blogging or if it's something of the past. I don't get the sense people are blogging as much as they used to. It certainly used to be a way in which scholarship was being promoted, but I don't know whether it's now Twitter or something else where those things are promoted. I certainly sympathize with the concern that you write something and how, among all of the thousands of things that are out there, do you get somebody's attention. I will say, don't send a reprint to Justice Sotomayor, because she'll send you a nasty letter back saying, never send me reprints. But certainly there are people who routinely submit things to judges with a cover letter and get, thanks very much letters back, or otherwise disseminate their scholarship. When I first started teaching, you would mail out reprints, but I don't think anybody does that anymore. Maybe you still do, or in electronic form. But you're right. This is a how do you get to distinguish in some way? If you're friends with Adam Liptek at the New York Times, that might be helpful.
Can I ask the panelists a question also about electronic resources, but a little different? So there's a lot of interdisciplinary people who have pretty fully assimilated the canon of the other discipline. And so you see a pretty literate citation to the non-legal literature in their work. Then there's the legal literature, which its kind of genesis moment is often whenever Lexis or Westlaw started archiving. And I see a lot of, Mark Tushnet had a great piece in the Supreme Court Review a couple years ago, I think on one of its anniversaries, kind of talking about how he read the first, I want to say the first volume, and here's the current work that's being done on this, and really the articles in this first volume deal with them pretty well, and it's too bad nobody cites them, right? Too bad nobody notices they're there. So does the fact that a lot of our literature is kind of taken in that form, or that maybe new law professors don't have to assimilate a legal canon, does that kind of affect the ease with which people make, especially claims about novelty, when there's actually a conversation that took place that the law review editors don't know about, and maybe even the writer doesn't know about? Or is that an observation, not a comment?
Well, I think it has to be so. There's whole worlds that exist in print that now people are not engaging with. I had an exchange with a student about a reporter that existed before or outside of coverage, and it was like, it wasn't there. And so I think that's true, and that's an opportunity of sorts. It means that there's archival possibilities for approaching questions that will probably not present themselves to other people in the field, and it's something to exploit, it's something to explore. I think it's also a question of what we're meaning by novelty. There's large overarching themes, for example, the counter-majoritarian difficulty, which has been articulated in many languages and with respect to many issues of law. And so one can either treat the whole thing as been there, done that, or try to understand what the new face of the question is with respect, as it stands in relationship to new bodies of work that didn't exist at the time of Bickle. So, but I think for purposes of this panel, there's an invitation to explore beyond the limits of digital space. It's whole life worlds are out there, and I guess in history it remains the case that there's an invitation, whereas in other fields there may not be an instinct to go do the reading, and that's a lovely thing to consider.
I have a thought on your question, which is kind of the reverse of it. I was recently speaking with a friend who's a law professor with a PhD in another discipline, and she was saying that she was uncomfortable with her work being available to everybody because she had written it for a particular audience. And so kind of going back to this issue of there are multiple ways to publish or modes of publication, in a way everything being available electronically means that I wonder how it changes, how it's going to change over time writing that might have been aimed at a subgroup.
I think as we're talking, I think that there's an interesting craft norm that distinguishes the legal academy from other parts of the academy. The whole workshop culture really privileges presenting work pre-publication, and the world of SSSRN and whatnot essentially blurs the line of publication so that things are getting noticed, certainly before they're published and sometimes even before they're picked up. And that can be experienced as a problem or an opportunity. But it seems a social fact at this point. At this point, publication feels remote and very far down the path of the work's reception. Even the placement decision can be that. And it does raise the question about how we come to know one another's work. Some of that is the workshop circuit, conferences and otherwise. Then there's new media. Then there's connecting one's work to ongoing developments or events to which it might be relevant. I think it's going to be quite various depending on the kind of question on which one's working. Doing a history paper, well, right now, I mean, there's wonderful history blogs out there, and I do think that people in the field pretty systematically read them, whatever could be said of the blogosphere generally. In legal history, it's becoming to be a much more common way of learning about what's emerging. It's very hard to speak categorically about all of our publication situations. But I think it mostly is an opportunity to the extent people are feeling tyrannized by the so-called placement process. There's certainly ways to get what it is you have to say out there, and then the big issue is by what practices do you make what you're doing visible to people who might care to know about it.
Well, another notorious form of law review tyranny is the citation and the requirement, if you say that the United States is a powerful country, to have three citations explaining why that is. But there's another side to it also, which is it's a way of entering your piece into a dialogue by instead of just sort of promiscuous citation. If you focus your citations on a particular dialogue that's existing in the literature, then it's a way of sort of positioning what you're saying, and in a way speaking to, Reva raised the question of audience, a way of speaking to the particular audience that you want to address, because of course law is a vast field, and any given piece is only going to be relevant to a subgroup of that field. So there's a question.
The other thing is just send your paper to the people with whom you're in conversation. When there's that modest, it's a very modest point, but people are interested to know that people are reading them after devoting all of that work to the question, so you may get a reader in that way, and it's a non-trivial way of connecting with audiences of special interest to you.
Are there any last questions? If not, I think we'll, with again the request that anybody please stick around for the section business meeting. We want to thank our panelists for a very enriching.